Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and good afternoon. Deputy Speaker, after some 3 years of consultation and achieving the support of key Aboriginal land councils, it would appear that this bill is okay and it's worth supporting. However, Deputy Speaker, what I think about this bill, and in fact what anyone in the House who is not of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage, what we think is in some ways quite irrelevant, because the only thing that really matters is what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people think of this bill, because it is up to them to decide what is good policy and what their needs are. Teasing that point out a little more, Deputy Speaker, I mean, it's been the paternalism of what I might call old white men over 233 years that is at the heart of the problems with public policy and decision-making regarding our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. When you drill down to all of the problems, deficiencies, the enduring and chronic disadvantage that is suffered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our country, so much of it goes to that paternalism over hundreds of years, which helps to explain why so many of the indicators remain so bad and so unaddressed, why year after year in the Parliament, when we have the closing the gap speeches and lots of hand-wringing, the indicators haven't changed that much. Now, we're in the practice once a year of looking at those indicators, whether it be education, employment, health and so on, and then we forget about them for another year, and so many of the problems go unaddressed. Well, I think we should be talking about those stats every day of the year until they get better. We should, people like me, my colleagues, we should be ashamed of these indicators every day of the year until they markedly improve, until we can finally stand in the Parliament and have a closing the gap speech that we can be so proud of and say, we have finally working together ensured that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the equal of the rest of the community of newer Australians in every other way. That we won't have to be ashamed of the fact that, for example, on the life expectancy front, that the life expectancy of kids up to 4 years old in our Indigenous population, that they're twice as likely to die as non-Indigenous children in this country. That we won't have to talk about every year and be ashamed of the fact that Indigenous Australians on average die about 10 years earlier than non-Indigenous Australians in this country. We won't have to talk about every year, it seems, that when it comes to all chronic diseases, with I think the only exception of cancer, that Indigenous Australians are so much sicker that the likelihood of circulatory disease for Indigenous Australians is twice that for non-Indigenous Australians. The fact that among Indigenous Australians, the likelihood of kidney disease is 11 times higher than being experienced by non-Indigenous Australians. The fact that the suicide rate for Indigenous Australians is double that of the general population. When it comes to education, Deputy Speaker, the fact that only about 60% of Indigenous students finish Year 12 in this country, compared to about almost 90% of non-Indigenous Australians finish Year 12. The fact that the employment to population rate for Indigenous Australians, youth through to retiring age at around mid-60s, is about half compared to an employment to population rate for non-Indigenous Australians of about 3/4. The fact that the median weekly income for Indigenous Australians is about 2/3 of the median weekly income for non-Indigenous Australians. The fact that Indigenous children are about 10 times more likely to be placed in out-of-home care in this country compared to non-Indigenous kids. And of course, so much has been said about justice and incarceration for as long as anyone can remember, and frankly, things haven't got any better. The fact that the Indigenous Indigenous inmates comprise about 1/4 of Australia's prison population, even though only about 2% of Australia's adult population are Indigenous adults. I'll say that again, that the Indigenous prisoner population throughout all of the jurisdictions in this country is about a quarter of the entire prison population, out of an adult population of about 2% are Indigenous. And of course, equally horrific, the fact that children 10 to 17 years old, for them the detention rate in the justice system is 26 times the detention rate for non-Indigenous children. And Deputy Speaker, you know, who's to blame for this? Who's responsible for this? Well, it is not our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's not their fault. It's entirely the responsibility of the paternalistic, often old white men, to use that term again, who for 233 years, normally thinking they're doing the right thing, but just as normally completely missing the mark, not actually sitting down with First Nations people and saying, how can we help? What do you need? Please design it for us and we will support you in every possible way to eventually end the enduring and endemic disadvantage that's experienced in this country. And Deputy Speaker, it's not as though we haven't had the answers at our fingertips over the years. I mean, decades ago now, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, you know, a very thorough examination of that particular issue, which laid out dozens of strong recommendations to start to wind back the shocking prevalence of Aboriginal deaths in custody. But yet to this day, none of the significant recommendations have been implemented. And we know about justice reinvestment. You know, there are so many clever people out there researching it at the moment and coming up with blueprints for effective justice reinvestment to keep people out of the justice system, to improve the lives and to keep them out of prison, keep them out of being in custody. We know the answers, but yet we ignore them. We know for a fact that raising the age of criminal responsibility would go quite some way to dealing with the incarceration and detention rate for youth, and the way in which that sets those unfortunate young kids on a pathway, you know, of bad outcomes. So, Deputy Speaker, when I you know, lament over 200 years of paternalism from people like me telling our First Nations people, you know, what they need, instead of asking them, what do you need and how can we support you? It's in this context that the 2017 First Nations National Constitutional Convention was so important, and so important that the government, the opposition, all members of the House would get behind the Uluru Statement from the Heart, because there was a wonderful opportunity to listen to First Australians and to find out finally what is needed and how can we help. So it is it's obviously, you know, a terrible thing that the government is yet to sign up to a voice to Parliament. It's a terrible thing that the Makarrata Commission has not been implemented. You know, these are the sorts of reforms that are needed in this country. You know, we need the speedy and full implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, including, just to be very clear here, including a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. And you know, what that looks like should be what First Nations people want it to look like. You know, if they want it to look like what we have in the New Zealand Parliament, where seats are reserved for the Maori, well, then I'll support that. I'll support whatever they want that will turn around over 200 years of persecution and disadvantage and shocking policy making. Regrettably, though, Deputy Speaker, the Uluru Statement from the Heart remains stalled. I mean, there is some work, there's some talk. I note the Minister, you know, he's a good person, he's trying to do good things, but the whole thing is stalled. So I call again on the government, in the last days of this Parliament, let's lay down some clear markers about what the future looks like. Let's have a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. Let's have a Makarrata Commission. Let's do whatever else we can do. And if we don't have the time to implement the changes, in the next maybe a couple of months, maybe 6 months, then at least lay down the markers and have bilateral support for that pathway forward. So the next parliament and the next government, whoever it is, knows that they have bilateral support, unanimous support in the House to bring about the reforms that are necessary. So in closing, Deputy Speaker, I make the point this is a good bill, 3 years in the making, does have the support of the big land councils, and that's good, and I think it's a credit to everyone who's been involved. Sure, we can always do things better, and in fact I've heard from some constituents that they regret that this matter will be dealt with with such little time today. I assume that there couldn't be more people involved in the debate, but generally a good job. But I do take this opportunity to emphasise what I think is a central part of the explanation for the continuing chronic and entrenched disadvantage for First Nations people in this country, and that's the paternalism that's characterised it up until now. Too many old white men making decisions for our First Nations people instead of sitting down with our wonderful First Nations people and working with them to deliver what they want and what they need. And what an important step in that direction would be sitting down and saying, right, how do we deliver the Uluru Statement from the Heart? How do we have a constitutionally enshrined, permanent and powerful voice in the Parliament? And how do we have a commission of some kind to oversee agreement making and truth telling? I call on the government. I call on the opposition. I know the opposition's on side on this. We just need the government to get on side, and then we can go into the next Parliament with a unanimous response and maybe start turning these things around. And maybe we won't have to, for the next, who knows how many years, put up with more and more of these completely unsatisfactory, shameful reports on closing the gap. Thanks, Deputy Speaker.